Good morning, everybody. Okay, so we were just talking about coral and zooxanthellae and the special relationship that they have. So this is a close-up look at those coral polyps once again. So algae is photosynthetic, which means that it produces its own sunlight or its own food using sunlight, which is why you'll find most of these corals in a tropical environment. So if you were to zoom out and look at the world and where we see coral reefs, it's all the way usually around the middle of the earth, right around the equator, which gets a ton of direct sunlight. Now there is coral that lives in other parts of the world besides shallow waters. There is deep sea coral, but deep sea coral doesn't actually have a relationship with zooxanthellae. They're not photosynthetic. Instead, they get all of their food using their tentacles. So if you remember that picture that we were looking at of the polyps, they use those tentacles to capture plankton that's swimming by or drifting down in the deep sea. So there's so many different types of coral out there. But what we're really focusing on today is the coral that we see in these environments that rely on the sun. So when we think of, we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but when we think of coral bleaching, what's really happening there is the coral is losing the algae that's living inside of it. So what I'd like to do now is actually take a close-up look at some coral skeletons. So we've talked a little bit about their color. We're going to go over to my special camera here and see what observations we can make by looking at different corals. Okay, so I have a few different examples of coral here. So this is some mounding coral, and I'm not sure the name of that one. This one right here, if you were to name that, what would you give it? That is mushroom coral. All right, so I'd like to take a closer look because as you zoom in here, you can see, you might notice there's all of these different holes here. And that's because if this coral was living, that's where all of the little polyps would be coming out of. And even if we look closer here at this sort of more fan-like coral, we can still see there's all of these different ridges, which is where the polyps would be. Actually, I'm going to zoom out a little bit more here. Okay. So I wanted to zoom in on these because this really shows us that coral is diverse not only in its color, but also in the shape. So this is an incredibly diverse animal. And so there's two sort of main types of coral here. So this is considered branching coral because if you look at it, I think it kind of looks like a tree. Do you see what I mean? Whereas this coral here, it kind of looks more like a big lump, and that's called mounding coral. And they grow really differently in the ocean, but both provide very important habitats for the animals that live there. Now, if you were to guess which one is a faster growing coral, which one would you say? Yes, so the branching coral does grow faster than our mounding coral. However, mounding coral tends to be a lot sturdier. So if you have a disturbance in the ocean, something like a storm or maybe even ships swimming by, the mounding coral is going to be more resilient to that. So even though it grows slower, the trade-off there is that it is a stronger type of coral. So there's really benefits to both. But really, coral reefs need all these different types of coral or all these different shapes to support the life that lives in these coral reefs that depends on them. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about coral and what it is, but why is it important? Why do we need coral? So coral is one of the most important animals and ecosystems in the ocean. So if you were to guess how much coral or how much of our ocean floor, if you were to step back and look at our ocean, how much of it is made of coral reefs? It's only 1%. So it is a tiny percentage of the entire ocean that is covered in coral. But it is incredibly important for a number of marine species that live in the ocean. It supports 25% of all fish in the ocean. 25% of all fish survive in coral reefs. So even though it is just a tiny portion of our ocean, so many different animals depend on it. And that also means that we depend on it too. There's a number of people that depend on coral reefs for their livelihoods because of the number of animals that live there. So these ecosystems are not just important for the animals there, but for us as well. But unfortunately, our coral, actually, I'd like to take a look at our tropical exhibit so we can get a good look at what coral reefs might look like in the ocean. So our tropical exhibit is our largest exhibit here at the aquarium, and it is based on a real dive site. So this is based on a real coral reef off the coast of Palau, which is in Micronesia, very close to Indonesia. And take a look. What do you see? Do you see fish? I see lots and lots of fish. But not only do I see, I don't just see fish. I see different types of fish. So I see some different shapes of fish. It's a little hard to see here in this view, but I see a stingray here. And I see some different patterns on fish as well. And I see we got a question from one of our viewers, Noah, who's wondering, does the color have to do with what they eat? And I would say yes, depending on the type of fish that we're talking about, their color has a lot to do with their diet. So a lot of fish will camouflage in order to hide in the coral, and that will allow them to surprise any fish that are coming by. One typical coloration that we see in a lot of predators is called countershading, and actually in prey animals too, which is when they have a light underside and darker top, like our great white shark here is a classic example. So this type of shading allows them to blend in really to the open ocean. If you're looking up, the white tummy is going to help it blend in with the light coming down, but if you are looking down, its darker back is going to help it blend in with the ocean, with the deep sea, which is dark. So yes, coloration has a lot to do with what animals eat. And so talking about all of the fish that depend on this coral reef, I wanted to highlight a couple of my favorite fish that we see. So one of my favorite fish in a coral reef that we actually have a really awesome example of, a bicolor one, is a parrotfish. So here is a picture of a parrotfish. Now, what do you think might be so special about this fish? Any observations that jump out to you? So one thing that I see here is this mouth of it. It seems to have a really prominent mouth. So what might it use that mouth for? Now, parrotfish are known in the coral reef for actually being able to eat coral, which is pretty amazing when you think about how hard coral is. Now, it's not their primary diet. Parrotfish are actually mainly eating algae that live on the coral reef, but as they're eating away, they might actually, chomp down on some coral and swallow that as well, and they are able to process it. And if you've ever been to a tropical beach and you're familiar with the white sandy beaches, or if you've ever dreamed about going to them like I do, you might be surprised to find out that those beaches, that sand, actually comes from parrotfish. They produce about 200 pounds of sand a year, which is a whole lot of sand. Oh, here's another really great picture. I think they're really cute, and you can really see those teeth there. It almost looks like a beak. Maybe I'll stand on this side. So their teeth are really special because they are fused. They have rows and rows and rows of it that are all fused together, so it has a very strong bite force. They have the bite force, I think, of 540,000 tons per inch, which is a very strong bite force, and really allows them to eat that coral, which not very many animals are able to do. And they have a couple other very cool adaptations that allow them to live in the coral reef. One thing they do that some people might think is kind of gross, but I think is kind of awesome, is every night before they go to sleep, they coat themselves in a giant bubble of mucus. Yuck. Now, why would they cover themselves in mucus like that? Who wants to sleep in a snot sleeping bag? So that not sleeping bag is what keeps them safe from parasites in the water. So just like we have to deal with things like mosquitoes and ticks, maybe if we're going camping, fish in the ocean have to deal with that as well. So there's a particular parasite that likes to suck their blood, and that mucus helps keep them safe from it, which is pretty great. So parrotfish is one awesome fish that we can find in coral reefs. Now, what else can we find in a coral reef? There's a few different types of animals. I can think of one that some people might be scared of, but it's actually very important for coral reefs as well and the health of those ecosystems. And another reason why Palau is a very special place in the ocean is because it was the first place to create a sanctuary for them. So I'm actually thinking of sharks. And here's an example of a shark that you would find in these coral reefs, a blacktip reef shark. Now, why would a shark be important for coral? Well, think about what sharks eat. Their particular favorite food is fish, small fish. And by preying on these fish, by keeping those populations in control, they're helping coral. So a lot of those fish will eat algae that grow on coral. And if we remove the sharks, then those fish will overpopulate, and then they'll run out of food and they'll start to disappear. And then algae will take over the coral and the coral reef will start to die out. So having predators like sharks is an important feature of most coral reefs. If you go to Palau and you're able to dive there, it's actually full of sharks. So having a number of sharks in a reef population is a sign that it's healthy. So really another great reason why we need to keep protecting our sharks. And here's a good view of our shark lagoon. So our tropical exhibit doesn't have these sharks, but you can see a few species here. We have that's our blacktip reef shark, pretty noticeable, the black tip on its fin. And then we also have our gray reef sharks in here, which seem to have swum away. And whoop, do you guys see this here? This little guy, not a shark, but something else you might find in a coral reef is our olive ridley sea turtle, who seems to be taking a nap. And of course, our zebra shark swimming by. Okay, so we've talked about some of the animals that live in these coral reefs. So we're starting to understand why they're important. But what's the problem then? What is the conservation portion of this? Well, unfortunately, our coral reefs are in trouble. So when I think of coral, I kind of think of them as like the Goldilocks animal. They like a very specific temperature to grow and be productive. And if that temperature changes, they're very sensitive to that change. So one of the things that's happening as a result of human activities is we're seeing a rise in our global temperature, which is affecting the temperature of our waters. So because our waters are starting to heat up, we're starting to see changes in our coral reef. So if we think about some of the things that are contributing to climate change, it's really our use of fossil fuels, which comes in a number of different ways. So we have a video here that we can watch to show us a little bit about what's happening to our coral as a result of these changes. So what do you see here? Do you see bright and colorful coral? Or it's not looking the same as what we were looking at before. So here's an example of what a healthy coral reef looks like. I see that it's incredibly bright. We see anemones and fish living on it. Can we go back to or find the bleaching part? I want to talk a little bit about that. So when we think of losing our coral, one thing that unfortunately happens is that the coral bleaches. So what does that mean? Does that mean that the coral has automatically died as soon as the temperature changed at all? So what's really happening is that if the water is getting too warm, the coral starts to stress out a little bit. Like I said, it's like a Goldilocks animal. So as it gets stressed, it actually expels that Zooxanthellae that was living with it. And that's when it loses its color and starts to look like this. Now, if we see this, it's kind of, again, we might think that that coral is dead, but Not necessarily. So there is a chance that the coral can recover even if it's lost the zooxanthellae. It just has to be in the right temperature again. So zooxanthellae can come back into it and the coral can recover, but it is hard for those conditions to happen. So what are some things that we can do to help coral either at home or what are we doing here at the aquarium? Because we are involved with a program that's going to help restore this coral, or that we're working on, and this is called Sea Corps. Now, this is a group of organizations that are all working to restore coral around the world, and we're working with them in particular in Guam to restore those reefs. So it is hard, you can't just change the temperature, but you can do things to help regrow the coral. So I'm going to show you some footage of what we're doing behind the scenes here. So if you were to go on a tour of the aquarium here, this is something that you might see. So this is what we would call our coral nursery. So each of these little pieces here are baby coral. Those are coral fragments. So what we're doing, what you're able to do with coral is you can actually break off little pieces of it. And if you give it something sturdy to attach to, we can start to regrow it. And so these are all little pieces of coral that we are hoping to grow. Now, we took a look earlier at our large exhibit Trop. We can go back to that really quickly. So that exhibit looks like a really huge coral reef. It's not real coral though. That is all modeled coral. And the reason why is because coral is extremely slow growing. So even the fastest coral can only grow about 1 inch per year. So to have a reef this size would take many, 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 many years to grow. And we wouldn't want to take this out of the ocean because we are, of course, trying to restore our coral reefs. So we do have some smaller exhibits that we have live coral in where you can really see the difference. But this does not happen to be a real one. But we're able to still recreate coral in a way that allows all of the animals to sort of use it in the same way that they would use a real coral reef. We can go back to looking at the coral nursery really quickly. There's one other tool that I think I can show about how we're able to sort of restore those coral reefs. We do have divers that go to Guam and actually put coral out there to hopefully bring them back. Another way that we're working on restoring coral is by creating artificial reefs in general. So I'm going to show you one of the tools that we use. Pretty sure this is something. So we can attach tiny fragments of coral to this. And by putting this, fish just swam by. By putting this at the bottom, hopefully our coral reef will be able to attach and regenerate. So even though it is a slow growing process, it is still one worth investing in. So again, here's another quick look. And you can again see the diversity of coral pieces. I see some fanned coral as well. So once this coral gets large enough, some of it will get transplanted into one of our exhibits here at the aquarium. And something else I'm seeing, so we've talked a little bit about different coral colors and how that comes from Zooxanthellae, but this coral also kind of looks like it's glowing a little bit to me. Do you see that? So why is it glowing? What is that all about? So this is something very cool that some coral can do that is a sign of coral health that scientists are still studying and trying to understand themselves. So we talked about how coral has that relationship with zooxanthellae and is able to photosynthesize and generate its own food. Something else that coral does is it absorbs that sunlight or that light, and then it starts to sort of reflect it back, and then you can see what it looks like at night. So this is fluorescent coral, and some coral is able to do this. And again, some scientists aren't really sure why. One theory about this is that its fluorescence helps protect it. It's kind of like a sunscreen for it. So that's just one idea. This is, again, something that's an active source of study, but it is a sign that the coral is healthy. So if you see fluorescent coral, you know that that coral is doing really well. And we have a great exhibit of this here at the aquarium. If you're able to visit, you can take a look at it. Oh, I see that we have a question from Bella. So Bella asks, how do corals eat and how do they move? Really great question. So I'm going to answer the second question first. How do they move? And the answer is they don't move. When they're very, very young, when they're tiny, tiny polyps, they sort of float through the ocean until they find a nice rock to plant down on. And once they're on that rock, they really don't move for the rest of their life. I'm going to grab one of our coral skeletons here. So you can see underneath, there's probably some sort of rock that was what it initially grounded onto. That's something that we have to think about when we're thinking about artificial reefs, is what can we give these corals to plant onto? And then they just stay there for the rest of their lives. And they stay there by secreting this calcium carbonate sort of skeleton that they really grow off of. Okay. Now, how do they eat? There's two different ways that corals can eat. Once again, here's that great image of the coral polyps. And this is actually a little video of them eating. So what does it look like they are doing? So you can see their little tentacles here sort of waving around in the current. And that's one of the ways they eat. So their tentacles have stingers on them, just like an anemone or a sea jelly, because they are all in the same family. And they use those tentacles to grab onto food or little plankton that might be drifting along in the current. Pretty cool. But the primary way they eat, though, is by having this relationship with the algae called Zooxanthellae, one of my favorite words to say. So that's what is giving the corals all of these different colors. And that Zooxanthellae is an algae that photosynthesizes. So it generates its own food from using the sun. So that photosynthesis provides the coral with lots of nutrition. Now, the reason they're able to survive briefly if they lose the Zooxanthellae and they're bleached is because they do have those tentacles that allow them to catch plankton. So that's why they're able to go on a little bit longer afterwards, even though for the long term, they really need that Zooxanthellae there. They have what's called a symbiotic relationship in order to help them. All right, so I think we have a couple minutes left. Thank you for your questions. Why don't we take one last look at our tropical exhibit, and we can end our program there by looking at some of our fish swimming around. And this is live, so if you ever feel like taking a look at our exhibits, you are welcome to. So we can see some of our rays swimming by, and just a really great image of all of our fish here. So thank you so much for joining us today. I hope that you'll tune in later this week, and thank you. Have a great day.